All right, all right. We are coming live from the Occupied City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. We are on year 2, day 3 of the occupation of the City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. This segment is going to be entitled. This segment is entitled "Rockford Reading." For anybody who may be watching this segment for the first time on the May 30th Alliance Facebook page or on the May 30th Alliance YouTube page. What it is that we do for the Rockford Reading segment is we read a piece of literature and we articulate and correlate how the issues being presented in the piece of literature directly or indirectly are tied to the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice that we are dealing with in Winnebago County in 2021. We also speak about different tactics or ideologies that we can incorporate in our struggle here based off some of the things that we read in these pieces of literature as well. And so today we are going to begin reading Rise of the Warrior Cop, and weekly, me and Friday, who I'll let introduce himself here in one moment. Weekly, we will go through on Wednesdays and read excerpts from Rise of the Warrior Cop and do the job of articulating how some of these things mentioned in this book affect or are connected to the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. So I'll let Friday introduce himself.
All right, so on Friday, and you could consider me a member of the May 30th Alliance. With all the things that have been going on in Rockford, Leslie Ralph and the May 30th Alliance brought it to my attention, things that I didn't even know exist, with things going on at Rockford City Market, and just, bringing light to a bunch of those things that we didn't know about. So I felt obligated, to be a part and contribute the best way I can, and just build and demonstrate, what I'm saying, with my brother Leslie Ralph. So that's pretty much all it is about me. I'm just, so we don't get into the first chapter, or we don't get to the introduction of Rise of the Warrior Cop, the militarization of America's police forces. Introduction. Are cops constitutional? That may seem like some odd question, perhaps even a little nutty. Police forces have been a part of the American criminal justice system since an 8-man department was established in Boston 175 years ago, and the first large department was created 7 years later in New York City. There has never been a serious constitutional challenge to the general authority of the police or the establishment of police forces, sheriff departments, or other law enforcement agencies, and it's unlikely there will ever be. Any federal court will undoubtedly have little patience for such challenge. In any hypothetical world where police were ruled unconstitutional would descend into chaos, probably rather quickly. Damn, it's windy. But appreciate it. But in a 2001 article for the Seton Hall Constitutional Law Journal, the legal scholar and civil liberty activist Roger Roots posed that just the question. Roots, a fairly radical libertarian, believes that the U.S. Constitution does not allow for police as they exist today. Thank you. The very least, he argues, the police department's powers and practices today violate the document, spirit, and intent. Under the criminal justice model known to the framers, professional police officers were unknown, Roots writes. The general public had broad law enforcement powers, and only the executive functions of the law, for example, the execution of writs, warrants, and orders, were performed by the constables or sheriffs, who might call upon the community for assistance. Initiation and investigation of criminal cases was nearly the exclusive province of private persons. The advent of modern policing has greatly altered the balance of power between the citizens and the state in a way that would have been seen as constitutionally invalid by the founders. Pardon me. The Roots argument may not be practical, but it's certainly provocative. On at least one point, most criminologists agree with him. No one can say for sure whether the founders would have approved of modern policing, but it's relatively certain that they wouldn't have recognized it. Criminologist and historian Samuel Walker writes in his book Popular Justice that the colonial America, most of the modern institutions of today's criminal justice system, the uniform police, prisons, probation, parole did not exist at all. The colonies did have appointed sheriffs and constables, and some also had marshals, but the duties associated with those jobs were largely administrative. Most were not salary positions. Instead, they received fees for tasks like serving subpoenas and collecting taxes. Since there were no fees associated with enforcing the criminal laws, for most sheriffs and constables, that task was a low priority. Sheriffs did oversee the jails, but jails were primarily used to hold defendants until trial. Incarceration as punishment was rare.
I think that, again, as we go through and read these things, we sort of just want to articulate how some of these things relate to the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County. And so and this has been something that's been common for multiple books that we've read, where at the beginning of the books they go through a history of where policing originated from, or how policing originated in some areas and how it has altered throughout time. And so I think that one of the things that is important to point out here is that at the beginning of the policing that existed at this point in time, people were still enslaved. Black people still lived, even though black people live now on the margins of the society, black people that may have not been enslaved live further out onto the margins of the society. And so the overall goals and task of policing look very different, and that is why some of these things didn't exist in the way that they exist now. Also, mass incarceration was something that had not come into being at this point in time, and even though this book specifically is about the rise of the warrior cop and the warrior cop mentality, those things are inextricably tied to mass incarceration as well. So I just think that that's one of the things that's important to point out is as you go through and read all these different books, the history that you get of policing and the institution of policing, and the history that you get of the institution of mass incarceration and jailing in the society as well. Yeah.
Law enforcement in the 18th century was mostly a private affair. Community mores, social stigma, and sharing the most important ways of maintaining order. Crime victims could bring their complaints to a grand jury, a panel of private citizens who had the power to indict, but the victim or his proxy was the party to initiate the charges. Professional, full-time prosecutors didn't exist. Under this system, enforcement of the laws was a universal duty. Every male citizen had a civic responsibility to serve on a watch, act as a constable, serve on a grand jury, or join a posse when necessary to apprehend a dangerous criminal. The word police wasn't used as a noun, it was a verb, meaning to watch over or monitor the public health and safety. This isn't to say that the colonial era's more individualized private methods of law enforcement will work today. As American towns grew from close-knit communities of people of similar ethnicities with shared traditions, values, and religion, to cities whose diverse population of immigrants had none of that in common, centralized police forces emerged to preserve order and enforce a common set of laws. Once neighborhoods stopped speaking the same language and worshiping in the same buildings, shunning and social stigmatization lost their effectiveness. Even so, Root's question is a useful starting point for this book because it shows just how far we come. The founders and their contemporaries will probably have seen even the early 19th century police forces as a standing army, and a particularly odious one at that. Just before the American Revolution, it wasn't the stationing of British troops in the colonies that irked patriots in Boston and Virginia. It was England's decision to use the troops for everyday law enforcement. This wariness of standing armies was born of experience and a study of history. An American statesmen like Madison, Washington, and Adams were well versed in the history of such armies in Europe, especially in ancient Rome. Even if the earliest attempts at centralized police forces would have alarmed the founders, today's policing would have terrified them. Today in America, SWAT teams violently smash into private homes more than 100 times a day. The vast majority of these raids are to enforce the laws against consensual crimes. In many cities, police departments have given up their traditional blue uniform, battle dress uniforms, modeled after soldier retire. Police departments across the country now sport armored personnel carriers designed for use on the battlefield. Some have helicopters and tanks and Humvees. They carry military-grade weapons. Most of this equipment comes from the military itself. Many SWAT teams today are trained by the current and former personnel from special force units like the Navy SEALs or Army Rangers. National Guard helicopters now routinely swoop through rural areas in search of pot plants, and when they find something, they send gun-toting troops dressed for battle, rappelling down to chop and confiscate the contraband. But it isn't just drugs. Aggressive SWAT-style tactics are now used to raid neighborhood poker games, doctors' offices, bars and restaurants, and head shops. Despite the fact that the targets of these raids pose little threat to anyone. This sort of force was once reserved as a last option to defuse a dangerous situation. It is increasingly used as the first option to apprehend people who aren't dangerous at all.
And then I think again one of the things to note out there is as they speak about and this is a microwave version of what they will extend out to be to go into further detail in throughout the entirety of this piece of literature. But as they're showing how time has passed, they're showing how the institution of policing has become more warlike and has become more army-like. And they speak about that happening because of the fact, like we talked about before, black people become more part of the mainstream society. People of color start to become more part of the mainstream society in America because of the way cities begin to be constructed and built. In the inside of America, it becomes a bigger onus on enforcing certain laws, not in a sense to keep the community safer or the city safer, but in a sense to preserve a certain order, in a sense to preserve a certain set of class system. And so I think that it's important that we note the history and the roots of policing and how that history and those roots have changed throughout time. I think one of the other things that's pointed out in what we just read that's important to note is that people say this all the time, that in impoverished community and poor communities, that in communities of color, that the police is like an occupying army, that the police occupy space in this city, in this area, that they're not welcome, that they don't have the consent of the people who live in this area to do some of those things. And so, again, this is pointing out the similarities that the police force that we have now have with the army that is being deployed in third world countries, or the armies that's being deployed overseas, and the same tactics that they use there, they use here in communities of color and poor communities. a lot of people who serve in the army and serve in the military, when they come over here, they get jobs in police departments and jobs in these different law enforcement agencies. And these law enforcement agencies train with each other and share ideologies and things of that nature with each other. And as was pointed out in here as well, when these even the differences that we may have ideologically with the founding fathers and with the Constitution and those things, it is a fact that one of the things that was a heavy catalyst in the American Revolution was the way that the British Army was occupying territory in the colonies, is because of the treatment that the people who lived in the colonies received from the from these British soldiers. And so I think that those things we have to point out. We have to be able to explain and to extrapolate to people how the same things that their forefathers were struggling and fighting against, that the British Empire was doing, those same things are now being done by this American government, by this society that exists currently in the country. So that's just, again, one of the things I think that is just important to try to point out there.
That was very well said. And I'm just soaking up this knowledge as we go, and that's what this is about. Just building and being more knowledgeable about how police forces work, and so we can learn how to counter or how to deal with this police terrorism and mass incarceration and all these things. So like I said, as I read, I'm all of this is new to me. I'm soaking it all up. And I encourage everybody else that want to be a part of this to come down here and read as well. Yeah. All right, for sure. You ready? All right. So check it out. There's now a dominant military culture within modern police agencies. Go to one of the many SWAT conferences and SWAT team competitions held throughout the year, and you'll find exhibit halls teeming with military weapons, gear, clothing, and imagery. The vendors at these events know their market. They use war imagery to imply goods because that's what make cops and police departments want to buy them. Many sell the same products to both the military and civilian police agencies. In the 1990s and 2000s, the company Heckler & Koch marketed its MP5 semi-automatic weapon with a slogan, "From the Gulf War to the Drug War, battle proven." Publications like Larry Flint's SWAT magazine feature ads that emphasize knocking heads and kicking ass, and print articles with headlines like "Go for the Throat" and "Warrior Mindset." There's been nothing secretive about this transformation, but because it's been unfolding over several decades, we don't seem to have noticed. On February 11, 2010, in Columbia, Missouri, the police department SWAT team served a drug warrant at the home of Jonathan Whitworth, his wife, and their 7-year-old son. Police claimed that 8 days earlier they had received a tip from a confidential informant that Whitworth had a large supply of marijuana in his home. They then conducted a trash pull, which turned up marijuana residue in the family's garage. That was the basis for a violent nighttime forced entry raid on the couple's home. The police stormed in screaming, swearing and firing their weapons, and within seconds of breaking down the door, they intentionally shot and killed one of the family's dogs, a pit bull. At least one of the bullets ricocheted and struck the family's pet, Corgi. The wounded dogs whimpered in agony. Upon learning that the police had killed one of his pets, Whitworth burst into tears. The Columbia's police department SWAT team recorded many of his drug raids for training purposes, including this one. After battling within the police over its release, the local newspaper was finally able to get the video through the state open records laws and posted it in the internet. It quickly went viral, climbing over to 1 million YouTube views within a week. People were outraged. The Columbia Police Force Department swapped with phone calls and emails, and its officers were condemned, cursed, and scolded. Some even received death threats. The video also made national headlines. On Fox News, Bill O'Reilly discussed it within the newspaper columnist and pundit Charles Krauthammer, Krauthammer, who assured O'Reilly's audience that botched raids like the one in the video were unusual. He warned viewers not to judge the war on drugs on base images coming out of Colombia. Krauthammer was wrong. This was not a botched raid. In fact, the only thing unusual about the raid was that it was recorded. For everything else, from the relatively little evidence to the lack of a corroborating investigation, the killing of the dog, the fact that the raid was for nothing more than pot, the police misfiring, and their unawareness that the child was in the home was fairly standard. The police raided the house and they intended to raid, and they even found some pot. The problem for them was that the possession of small amounts of pot in Colombia had been decriminalized, and they did Whitworth with possession of drug paraphernalia for the pipe they found near the marijuana, a $300 fine. The reaction to the video was fascinating and perhaps encouraging because, again, the raid itself was indistinguishable from the tens of thousands of similar raids conducted in each year in America. It was as if the country, or at least the internet generation, was for the first time seeing firsthand, on-the-ground footage of the way the drug war is fought every day. And they found it terrifying. Most Americans still believe we live in a free society and revere its core values. My fault. I'm going to say that again. Most Americans still believe we live in a free society and revere its core values. These principles are pretty well known. Freedom of speech, religion, and the press, right into a fair trial, representative democracy, equality before the law, and so on. These aren't principles we hold sacred because they're enshrined in the Constitution or because they were cherished by the founders. These principles were enshrined in the Constitution. Enshrined in the Constitution and cherished by the framers precisely because they're indispensable to a free society. This book answers the question, how did we get here? How did we evolve from a country whose founding statesmen were adamant about the dangers of armed, standing government forces? A country that enshrined the Fourth Amendment in the Bill of Rights and revered and protected the age-old notion that the home is a place of privacy and sanctuary. To a country where it has become acceptable for armed government agents dressed in battle garb to storm private homes in the middle of the night. Not to apprehend violent fugitives or thwart terrorist attacks, but to enforce laws against nonviolent consensual activists. How did a country push into a revolution by protest and political speech become one where protests are met with flash grenades, pepper spray, and platoons of riot teams dressed like RoboCops? How did we go from a system in which laws were enforced by citizens, often with non-coercive methods, to one which order is preserved by armed government agents too often conditioned to see streets and neighborhoods as battlefields and the citizens they serve as the enemy? Before we begin, a few organizational notes are in order. First, this is not an anti-cop book, although it includes plenty of anecdotes about bad cops. There are plenty good cops. Some of them are interviewed in this book. The fact that we need cops and there are limited situations in which we need SWAT teams. If anything, this is an anti-politician book. Bad cops are the product of bad policy, and policy is ultimately made by politicians. A bad system loaded with bad incentives will unfairly produce bad cops, and that's a fact. The good ones will never enter the field in the first place, or they will become frustrated and leave police work, or they will simply turn bad. And that's what Leslie Ralph mean when he said there is no such thing as a good cop. Right, bro? At best, they'll have unrewarding, unfulfilling jobs. This book explores the consequences of having bad cops who are too angry and too eager to kick down doors and who approach their jobs with entirely the wrong mindset, but with the eye toward identifying and changing policies that allow such people to become cops in the first place. And that allows them to flourish in police work. Second, some of this book is the product of historical research. Some of it is original reporting done exclusively for the book, and some of its original reporting I've done for other publications. Many, okay, damn, that little wind breeze made me lose where the fuck I was at. Okay, many of the passages taken from the reported pieces I've already published are reprinted in verbatim, or nearly verbatim. Finally, many of the anecdotes mentioned in this book happened years or decades ago. Sometimes there was a flurry of initial coverage of an incident, but then no coverage of the resolution. I tried to find out how all of these incidents were resolved, but that wasn't always possible. For example, an anecdote may have come from a complaint in a lawsuit against the police department that was resolved with a closed settlement, which means the police account of the incident was never revealed. Or a police department may have refused to disclose information about an internal investigation, leaving only press accounts of an incident. In cases like these, I indicated the source of these accusations to let you know that they are one-sided narratives. The story of police militarization in America begins with lessons from ancient Rome, then moves quickly through the Dark and Middle Ages into the origins of modern policing. We examine the foundations of the American experiment laid down during the colonial period and the American Revolution. The right to privacy, the castle doctrine, and the demilitarization of free societies. Then look at the emergence of the modern centralized police department in the early 19th century. After quickly passing through the progressive era, the professionalization movement, and alcohol prohibition, we come to the real beginning of the story of modern police militarization. The social upheaval, civil unrest, and culture wars of the 1960s. At that point, the book becomes a more focused narrative. We follow the militarization trend through the Nixon's rhetorical wars on crime and drugs in the 1970s, Reagan's all-too-literal drug war in the 1980s, and the massive expansion of SWAT teams and proliferation of military gear, and the federalization of policing in the 1990s. The final chronological chapter looks at how the war on terrorism has accelerated the militarization of police, how SWAT teams and the paramilitary approach the policing have moved beyond the wars on drugs and terror, and how frighteningly willing the government has become to use this sort of force to make a political statement. The police ends with a chapter on reforms and recommendations on how to roll back the militarization of policing in America, and whether any meaningful reform is still possible.
And then so I think one of the things that's a constant in this book is speaking about the removal of castle doctrine, which is essentially that you have right to privacy within your home, and that the state can't enter into your home without your permission. It can't use force to enter into your home, and that's something that we have seen is very far removed from the type of society that we live in now. I think one of the things as well to point out is that the no-knock warrants that exist now, and the SWAT teams that exist now that raid into people's houses on a regular basis, they said up to 100 times a day in this country. Those teams have not existed just as long as policing has existed. Those things are fairly new, beginning in the 1960s, really, and then into the 1970s and 1980s. And when the no-knock warrant law was first passed in New York, Malcolm X called it a When the no-knock warrant was first passed in New York, Malcolm X called it a anti-Negro law. H. Rap Brown had a speech talking about how the law was going to be used to kill black people. And we have seen to this day how regularly when these botched warrants, these botched raids happen, or as the author said, not botched, but when these raids happen in general, one of the things that's a regularity is that it leads to the loss of human life, or it leads to the physical, some type of physical assault happening to someone, or someone being shot. And we can extrapolate that out to just last year when Breonna Taylor was killed as a warrant was being served. And there was no consequence for any of the officers who did those things. And so I think that it's important for us to remember just how new some of these things that some of the actions that the institution of policing takes are, because when you realize how new some of them are, you can get to a place of imagining a world, imagining a society without them and without those things being there and taking place. And here I'll take over for you a little bit, do some reading, and then just go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, I had exercised my right to demonstrate the Castle Doctrine laws, and I was pulled out of my house at gunpoint, and found myself fighting a case that eventually, they threw it out. But I did everything that I felt like I needed to do. I protected myself in my home, and I was pulled out of my house at gunpoint by at least 9 or 10 cops with ballistic shields, automatic rifles, and I was in crutches. So they pulled me out of my house, made me walked to the cops in ballistic shields, threw me in the back of the cruiser, and laughed about how they left my crutches and shit like that. So,
And then I think again, one of the other things that we experienced last fall, or last winter and early spring out here, was the police department coming out regularly and basically doing raids on at the occupation at City Hall, coming in, taking blankets and taking hand warmers, coming with 15 plus police officers, shutting down the street. And one of the things I would often tell people is that if we had some type of office space or something like that, this is the same type of actions that they would be taking there. The reason that they were doing these things were not to keep the community safer, was not to because some type of crime with the victim had happened. It was all in an effort to preserve the status quo, in an effort to preserve this class system that exists in the society. And so that introduction is just very poignant for some of the issues that we're dealing with. All right, so we're in chapter 1, From Rome to Rich. Given that most of the American founders were students of the Enlightenment and its revival of classical learning, most of them looked fondly on the Roman Republic and drew lessons from the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, for example, wrote the Federalist Papers under the pen name, quote, Publius, end quote, in honor of the first consul of the Roman Republic and one of the revolutionaries who overthrew the monarchy. John Adams, in particular, was a fan of Cicero, who spent much of his public life warning of the dangers of militarism and dictatorship, and was eventually murdered for it. The American forefathers were keenly aware of the price that Rome paid by permitting the military to gain such power in their society, and they generally sought to avoid its mistakes. It seems fitting then that the world's first documented, organized police force would have been established in ancient Rome, and the rise of that ancient police force raised many of the same questions about balancing security with liberty that we debate today. After Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Rome fell into chaos as the empire's powerful factions maneuvered to seize power. Anticipating bloodshed, faction leaders began to pull elite troops from their armies to serve as bodyguards. These guard units came to be called Praetorium cohorts, after the Praetoria cohorts who guarded the tents of Roman generals during war. By the end of the reign of Emperor Augustus, and for the next several centuries, the Praetorian Guard would take on more of the roles we now associate with the conventional police force, including investigating serious crimes, making arrests, providing security during Colosseum games, collecting taxes, spying on suspected revolutionaries, collecting undercover intelligence, and even fighting fires. During his reign, Augustus established two other policing forces less prestigious than the Praetorians. Around 13 BC, he created the cohorts urbanani, or urban cohorts, which he charged with quelling riots and keeping order in the streets. And in AD 6, he created an additional order called the Vigils. First charged exclusively with fighting fires, the Vigils would also take on police duties and came to serve as Rome's night watchmen. And so even we can see as far back as you dated into the 13 BC and 44 BC and early AD, you can see that one of the number one goals of police forces, of forces from the state, forces from the power structure, is not to protect people in the society or protect people in the city or protect the community, but to uphold the status quo, but to uphold the class systems that exist, to keep people from resisting the oppression and exploitation that they're dealing with. Augustus's Praetorian Guard would eventually become one of the most powerful institutions in Rome. In later years, the Guard's loyalty often determined who would become the next emperor, and its members may have assassinated as many as a dozen Roman emperors and many more potential heirs. The interesting thing about Augustus's first police forces is that to implement them, he had to navigate some of the same challenges and objections to civic policing that arise today. He had to balance public safety and the maintenance of order by at least appearing to respect civil liberties. More importantly, he had to find ways to assure the Senate and the citizenry that the responsibilities of these bands of order-keeping public servants, all drawn from the Roman army, were distinct from the duties that Romans normally associated with soldiers. Even in ancient Rome, the public was acutely sensitive to the threat of militarized policing. Prior to Caesar's march on Rome in 49 BC, soldiers were forbidden to enter the capital with soldiers. There had never been a permanent standing army within the city. It was Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, the city's outer boundary, with his army that triggered the civil war that ended the Republic. After Augustus, the Praetorian Guard became an increasingly powerful force in the upper echelons of Roman power. As conquest and empire became central tenets of Roman society, the day-to-day lives of Romans became infused with militarism. Soldiers and generals began to be held in higher esteem than scholars and statesmen. The policing was reconnected with the Roman army. Eventually, the Guard directly interfered with the succession of emperors, sowing further instability. The Praetorian Guard was finally disbanded by Emperor Constantine in AD 312. Its members had made the mistake of backing his opponent. About 1,800 years would pass before the world would see another metropolitan police force as centralized and organized as those that Augustus first established in Rome. There are also some broader parallels between Rome and the establishment of policing in the modern world. During the Roman Republic, disputes were settled between and within families. Criminals were often punished by their own relatives, who faced social pressure to make right by victims and their kin. But under Augustus, the state began to take on a much larger role in these traditionally private and provincial affairs. As Rome was transformed from republic to empire, dispute resolution, punishment, and remuneration, which had once handled privately, fell exclusively to the emperor's executive power. As we will see, Britain and the early United States went through a similar transition centuries later. In the United States, the colonial era concerns about standing armies gave way to more immediate problems like crime and rioting as the country moved into the industrial age. Cities turned to centralized power, police agencies reporting to the mayor, to impose law and order. I think one of the things to point out there is when you speak to a lot of historians and philosophers and intellectuals, one of the things that they point out is that America is an empire, that America is engaging in imperialism. And so it's appropriate to compare it to Rome, which was before America, besides America, the greatest empire that has existed on the earth. And I don't mean to use the word greatness to greatness doesn't necessarily have a positive or a negative attribute to it. It just sort of speaks towards the acts of whatever it is you're talking about. And so the greatness of the Roman Empire was vast, the same way that the greatness of this American empire is vast. I believe, to properly absolve ourselves of these issues, we have to look at it from a standpoint of imperialism and look at it as an empire. A lot of times people say that America's not a country, it's a business, and that's something that is, I do understand the concept behind that, but when you take a global look at it and you see that America has army bases in all of these different countries, that America is part of staging coups in different countries and putting different leaders in power and destabilizing different economies, you start to begin to realize that truthfully what America is on a global standpoint is an empire, and it is imperialism that we're dealing with. And the same way that Rome fell because of the type of imperialism that they were engaging in, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy that America will suffer some of those same failures and some of those same fallbacks or whatever. What you looking like on time? What you looking like on time?
I said I got about the first chapter. I'm gonna sit with you through the first chapter.
Let's see where we at right here. We on page 4. Ooh. First chapter, that's gonna be like 30 more minutes. No, I don't know if it'll be 30 more minutes. We on page 4. Let's see. It's like a topic changer right here. So we get to this topic changer and then we see what they're talking about. Low key, I fuck around, need a favor from you. Go buy McDonald's, so I fuck around there. Okay. I for say we get to this little joint right here, just like switching the topic, so that way we at least finish this topic off. Okay, so back to Rise of the Warrior Cop. We're on page 4, chapter 1, From Rome to Ritz. In the years that follow Rome's fall, organized policing largely disappeared from Europe. One exception were the few cities in Italy that became the hubs of trade and culture. As they grew, cities like Florence and Venice had to contend with urban issues of crime, poverty, and disease. To keep order, which kept the trade flowing, leaders established patrols to protect the property of businesses, tradesmen, and manufacturers, and to enforce curfews during outbreaks. By the Middle Ages, a nationalized police force had emerged in France, though more as an effort to protect the monarchy from revolt than to protect the citizens from crime. Maintaining the existing order was the only priority. Civil liberties were of little concern. The English tradition was different. Because of its isolation, England was relatively more stable than continental Europe during the Dark and Middle Ages. It didn't face the constant threat of revolution. Ruling regimes in other parts of Europe had to maintain order by suppressing dissent and keeping the public from posing a threat to them. In Britain, preserving order meant protecting lives, rights, and property from thieves, vandals, and murderers. Consequently, the English benefited from an orientation toward local rather than centralized policing. Before the Norman conquest of 1066, Britain was organized into tithings, groups of about 10 families in a given geographical area who were expected to maintain peace and order on their land. If a member of a tithing committed a crime, the group was expected to turn the transgressor over to the king, or the tithing would be punished as a group. Groups of 10 tithings were then grouped into larger units called shires. To keep order in the shires, the crown appointed a representative called a reeve, a position usually filled by one of the shire's own residents. The position came to be called the shire reeve, the source of our modern word sheriff. This mix of incentives for tithings enabled them to maintain order with the balance of liberty and accountability. The English system also benefited from its adherence to common law rather than Roman law. Because the objective of common law is dispute resolution rather than enforcing the will of the sovereign, it offers more protection of individual rights. English citizens' ability to sue law enforcers who violated their rights was unheard of in countries with centralized police forces. English trials were also governed by sets of rules of procedure, again, in stark contrast to the rest of Europe. Some of that began to change after the Norman conquest. The Normans used the existing, traditional English structure to impose a more centralized systems like those on the continent. Sheriffs became more beholden to the crown, and the Normans introduced the positions of constable, which would come to replace the sheriff as the crown's preferred local law enforcement officer. Still, while the Normans made some important changes to the way British society kept order, the tradition of common law rule, trials with set procedures, and individual rights was too ingrained to be overcome. As with Imperial Rome and Italy in the Middle Ages, urbanization in England eventually created the need for a new system. By the 14th century, as England grew more populous and industrialized, the tithing system grew less useful. Social pressure lost its effectiveness in keeping order as English citizens came to live closer together, next to neighbors they didn't already know. In response, Parliament authorized the position of urban constable to keep order. Constables were permitted to draft citizen watchmen to patrol city streets at night and raise the, quote, hue and cry, end quote, to call up all men between ages 15 and 60 in the event of an emergency. By the early 18th century, England, and London in particular, had thoroughly outgrown its antiquated system of preserving order. London at that time held 10% of the country's population within its city limits. The streets, overrun with highwaymen, pickpockets, and burglars, were growing more dangerous. The constables and their deputies were overworked and easily corrupted. In more affluent areas, magistrates could afford to hire thief-takers, freelance crime fighters who would capture crooks in exchange for a bounty. But crime persisted, and British officials would soon be forced to look for a better solution. And then that brings us to a changing of a topic in this first chapter. And so I think one of the things that I would point out from the section that we just read is again how once as time passes, you see the institution and the system of policing be altered and begin to change, and you see that the commonality is not simply protecting and serving, or not even protecting and serving. It's maintaining a certain order, maintaining a certain system, a certain class system, and so. I think that that's just something that we have to keep in mind when we begin to talk about the institution of policing. I think another one of the things we have to keep in mind is how often the people involved in this line of work have become corrupted and have been corrupted. And so even here they talk about how the deputies were overworked and easily corrupted in London at the time that these things were going on. And we see these same things happening throughout the history of policing, people becoming corrupted and being in these positions of power. And it's a statement that says absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's something that has rung true when it comes to the institution of policing. And again, one of the things that I think is very important about being able to articulate these issues and about being able to address and then get to a place of absolving these issues is tracing these things back to their roots. It's to be able to explain to people that since the beginning of policing, even when you trace it back to how it existed in Rome or in England or in Europe in earlier centuries, one of the things that has been inherently a part of it is corruption. One of the things that has been inherently a part of it is not protecting and serving and keeping the community safe, but maintaining business as usual, maintaining a certain structural order, a certain class order. And it's once we accept that is a historical precedent that is part of this institution that we begin to understand why it is important for us to form new institutions and to create new institutions and create new systems. And so I know in the introduction of this, one of the things that Radley Belko said is that this isn't a book against policing or anti-policing book, but I believe that when you read this book with the context of other books like The End of Policing and New Jim Crow and Freedom is a Constant Struggle and some more, and Locking Up Our Own, you begin to understand how, even though he may not be presenting it as an anti-policing book, when it's put together with all the other books that speak on policing, you understand why being anti-police is something that is a necessity for us to get to a more humane society, a less corrupt society. And so in the same way where at the beginning of this he spoke about how he does not believe he doesn't think all cops are bad and that there are some good cops, but he goes on to explain why those good cops don't manifest themselves. I don't believe that there's any historical any historical precedent that says that the institution of policing can produce good cops. So we have to get to a place of creating new institutions, creating more humane institutions, creating less corrupt institutions, and creating institutions that are about uplifting the community, protecting the community, serving the community, and not about subjugating the community, oppressing the community, exploiting the community, marginalizing the community, and trying to keep people in caste systems or class systems and maintaining some type of order. What about you? What's some of your thoughts about this first section that we read here?
Man, right now, I'm just soaking it all in, man. A lot of that stuff is really relatable to a lot of the things that I've been seeing down here. You know what I'm saying? I'm tired and I'm trying to get back to. 1 second. Damn, bro, you done showed and put me on blast with this one, but I definitely got a lot of thoughts about some shit, man. Give me a quick recap. I'm not gonna sit here and act like I want to just falling asleep right now. I'm not gonna act like that at all. Yeah, that's why I ain't even gonna lie to y'all on this live. I'm not gonna even lie to y'all, bro. Hey, but
it's natural. It's natural. We only a few pages in, so you can just talk about the part that you read. With some of your closing thoughts on the pieces that you read.
Shit, man. Let's get a quick recap, man. I'm all over. I definitely, and you mainly had the SWAT team. Yeah, my mind be racing. That's why I try to, I gotta try to comment like as I'm reading this shit. But yeah,
take time. You want to get into the groove of doing it.
But the laws definitely, that shit definitely set up to fuck us over though, because like I said though, I was demonstrating the whole castle doctrine. You're supposed to be safe in your own home. Like, you're supposed to be able to protect yourself, especially if you within your rights. You got the rights to carry. You got your FOIA card, and somebody is looking to do harm onto you. There's no reason why I should have been pulled out of my house at gunpoint. So.
And so again, me and Friday gonna be going through and reading Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Belko. I would recommend anybody who has not read this book yet to get this book. We're gonna start keeping the library, the May 30th Alliance Library, back down here at City Hall. A few people done pulled up asking for books, and we ain't had it down here, so we're gonna keep it. We're gonna bring it back and start keeping it down here. And so we're gonna try to start having multiple copies of these books. So as we're reading them, if people want to pull up and grab them, they can. But again, this is one of the books that we're finna start throwing into our rotation of doing these Rockford readings and going through. So stay tuned for another Rockford reading with Leslie and Friday, going through Rise of the Warrior Cop, coming to you soon. Every Wednesday, once a week. So we want to say justice for Demetrius Bennett, justice for Mark Barmore, justice for Geno Washington, justice for Jovan Fresco, justice for Kerry Blake, justice for Logan Bell, justice for Philip Johnson, justice for Suzette Babler, justice for Jasper Banks, justice for Faustin Guaitigo, justice for Shannon Graves, justice for Lil Mike Sago, justice for Eddie Patterson, justice for Joseph McCormick, and justice for Mikey Guzman. We outside. Rest in power.